The blizzard had been howling for 19 days when Obadiah Stark kicked through thigh-deep snow to check on the madman who had built a fire pit under his bed. Inside the cabin, Silas Merriweather slept peacefully on a hide stretched over glowing coals that hadn't been fed fresh wood in over 2 weeks. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of forgotten frontier wisdom move you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's tale is even more unbelievable. The morning of January 12, 1839, Silas Merriweather woke to silence. That was wrong. Virgil Creed always woke first, always had the fire going by the time Silas opened his eyes. The cabin was cold, not the crisp cold of a winter morning with a fire burning down. This was the bone-deep cold that meant the fire had been dead for hours. Silas sat up in his bedroll. Across the small cabin, Virgil lay motionless in his own bedding, positioned near the stone fireplace they had built together the previous summer. Silas already knew. He had known the moment he woke to that terrible silence, but he crossed the dirt floor anyway, knelt beside his partner of 3 trapping seasons, and confirmed what the cold had already told him. Virgil Creed had frozen to death sometime during the night. The blizzard had started 6 days earlier. They had weathered bad storms before, but this one was different. By day 2, the snow had drifted higher than the cabin's single window. By day 3, the wind was strong enough that going outside to retrieve firewood from their stack meant risking disorientation and death within 20 feet of the door. On day 4, Virgil had made one final trip to bring in the last armload of wood from the outdoor stack. He had returned, ice-covered and shaking, reporting that the remaining woodpile was buried under 6 feet of drift. They had burned their last piece of firewood the evening of day 5. Virgil had insisted they let the fire burn through the night rather than trying to bank coals for morning. "We'll wake up warm, enough to think clearly," he had said. "Storm might break overnight. We can dig out the woodpile at first light." The storm had not broken overnight. Silas didn't remember the fire dying. He had fallen asleep watching the flames, exhausted from days of tension and short rations. The cabin's temperature must have dropped gradually. His body, wrapped in blankets and a buffalo robe, had maintained enough warmth to keep him alive. Virgil, positioned closer to the fireplace, had apparently given Silas the better bedding. That was like Virgil. Practical, quiet. The kind of man who made decisions without announcing them. Silas sat beside Virgil's body for an hour. The blizzard continued outside. The cabin grew colder. Eventually, survival instinct forced him to move. He broke apart one of their 2 chairs and fed the pieces into the fireplace. The wood burned quickly, providing a few hours of heat. He used that time to wrap Virgil's body in canvas and secure it outside in the snow. The ground was frozen, too hard for burial. That would have to wait for spring. He broke apart the 2nd chair that evening. The table went the next morning. By day 8 of the blizzard, he was burning anything that would combust. By day 9, the storm finally broke. Silas dug out the woodpile, got a proper fire going, and spent the next 2 days regaining strength. On the 3rd day after the storm, he buried Virgil on a rise overlooking the creek where they had trapped together. He marked the grave with stones and stood in the snow trying to find words. None came. Finally, he walked back to the cabin and sat inside staring at the fireplace. That was when the obsession began. Silas spent the weeks following Virgil's death studying fire with an intensity that bordered on madness. He fed the fireplace constantly, watching how quickly wood transformed to ash. He timed the burns. A log the thickness of his forearm lasted approximately 45 minutes before it needed replacement. Larger logs, as thick as his thigh, might burn for 2 hours, but sleep required 6 to 8 hours minimum. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Any fire left unattended would die before morning. He tested banking techniques that other trappers swore by. He tried burying coals under ash to slow combustion. The coals lasted longer, but produced almost no heat. He tried the massive overnight log method, placing the largest piece of wood he could fit into the fireplace before sleeping. It bought him perhaps 4 hours of warmth. He still woke cold. The fundamental problem revealed itself clearly. Fire consumed fuel and produced heat immediately. When fuel was gone, heat disappeared within minutes. The stone fireplace held warmth slightly longer than the air, but not by much. An hour after the fire died, the stones were cold to the touch. Except that was not entirely true. One morning, Silas woke after the fire had died during the night. He was cold, but not dangerously so. The cabin's interior temperature had dropped, but something had prevented it from plummeting to the outside temperature. He placed his hand against the fireplace stones. They were not warm, but they were not ice-cold either. They held a residual heat that his hand could barely detect, but that his face, held close to the stone, could definitely sense. He began experimenting. He built fires of different intensities and let them burn out completely. Then he tracked how long the stones retained detectable warmth. A small fire that burned for 1 hour left stones that cooled within 2 hours. A large, hot fire that burned for 4 hours left stones that remained noticeably warm for nearly 6 hours. The principle emerged. Stone absorbed heat during burning and released it slowly afterward. The hotter the fire and the longer it burned, the more heat the stone stored. The problem was that standard fireplaces did not have enough stone mass, and what stone they had was positioned to radiate heat into open air where it dissipated uselessly. Silas started paying attention to other sources of stored heat. He noticed that soil warmed by afternoon sun remained warm after sunset. He observed that underground springs never froze even when surface air temperatures dropped far below freezing. He examined his own body heat, realizing that blankets and hides did not generate warmth but trapped the heat his body produced. Heat could be stored. Heat could be released. Slowly. The question was not how to make fire burn longer. The question was how to capture fire's heat in something that would release it throughout the night while he slept. Most trappers thought the solution was better fireplaces or more fuel. Silas began to suspect the solution was abandoning fireplaces entirely and building something completely different. Spring arrived in late March of 1839. Silas finished his trapping season and spent 2 weeks visiting every cabin within a 20-mile radius. He told other trappers he was checking trap lines and trading information about beaver populations. In reality, he was studying heating systems with obsessive focus. Clement Fossey, a French-Canadian trapper who worked the northern tributaries, had a fireplace built with double-thick stone walls. Silas asked to examine the construction. Clement explained that his father had taught him to use more stone because it held heat longer. Silas spent an hour running his hands over the masonry, noting how Clement had positioned stones in tight courses with minimal mortar gaps. The fireplace stayed warm for hours after the fire died, but it still did not solve the overnight problem. Obadiah Stark's cabin featured a massive central chimney built from river stones. Obadiah was proud of the construction and explained that the chimney mass absorbed heat from fires and radiated it into the cabin even after burning stopped. Silas tested this claim by visiting in the evening. After Obadiah's fire had been out for 3 hours, the chimney stones were still faintly warm, but again, not warm enough or long enough. Barnabas Quinn, an Irish trapper who had worked the mountains for 12 years, used a different approach entirely. He built small fires and relied on heavy blankets and furs for warmth. Fires for cooking, Barnabas said, beddings for sleeping. His cabin was constantly cold, but Barnabas claimed he never noticed. Silas noticed. He also noticed that Barnabas looked older than his 42 years and coughed frequently. In early April, Silas traveled to the nearest trading post, a 3-day ride east. The post was operated by Gideon Talmadge, a former stonemason from Pennsylvania who had moved west in 1832. Silas spent 2 days asking Gideon questions about masonry, heat retention, and construction techniques. Gideon explained thermal mass principles without using those exact words. Stone holds heat proportional to its weight and density, he said. Limestone's decent, granite's better, sandstone's middling. The thicker the stone and the hotter the fire, the longer it stays warm. He showed Silas examples of different stone types and discussed how buildings back east used massive stone foundations that moderated temperature swings between day and night. Silas asked about underground construction. Gideon mentioned root cellars and how they maintained constant cool temperatures year-round because Earth insulated them from surface temperature changes. Works both ways, Gideon said. Keeps cool things cool in summer, keeps warm things warm in winter. Earth's the best insulator there is, long as you keep water out. On the ride back to his territory, Silas thought constantly about everything he had learned. Stone stored heat. Mass mattered. Underground spaces resisted temperature change. Fire produced heat, but did not store it. The solution was becoming clear. He needed to combine fire with massive stone in an insulated environment where heat could not escape quickly. He needed to build something no trapper had built before, something that seemed completely insane. Silas returned from St. Louis in late July of 1839, carrying supplies that made no sense to anyone who saw them. He had sold his spring furs for a decent profit and spent nearly half of it on materials. 40 pounds of flat fieldstones, carefully selected for uniform thickness. 2 iron brackets designed for heavy construction. A specialized spade with a narrow blade for digging in confined spaces. Heavy canvas treated with linseed oil. And a collection of iron pins that looked like oversized nails. Obadiah Stark encountered Silas on the trail 12 miles from the trapping grounds. "You planning to build a church?" Obadiah asked, eyeing the stones tied to Silas's pack horse. "Building a cabin," Silas said. "Most men just cut logs." "I need the stones for something else." Obadiah did. Not press further, but word spread quickly through the scattered trapping community. Silas Merriweather was hauling building stones into the wilderness. The man whose partner had frozen to death was doing something strange. Silas selected his new cabin site in early August. He chose high ground, with good drainage, adequate distance from the creek, and clear sight lines. The location made water collection more difficult, but Silas was not optimizing for convenience. He was optimizing for survival. He began by marking the cabin's dimensions on the ground. 16 feet long, 12 feet wide. Then he did something that made no sense to anyone who observed. He marked a second rectangle inside the first, positioned where the sleeping area would be. This interior rectangle measured 4 feet by 3 feet. And instead of building up, Silas started digging down. Barnabas Quinn rode, passed on the third day of excavation, and stopped to watch. Silas was waist-deep in a rectangular pit, throwing dirt out with his narrow spade. "You building a root cellar inside your cabin?" Barnabas called. "No," Silas said, not stopping his work. "What then?" "Sleeping pit." Barnabas stared. What?" "I'm going to sleep over it." "Over a hole in the ground?" "Over a fire in a hole in the ground." The silence that followed was profound. Finally, Barnabas said, "You're going to burn to death in your sleep." "No," Silas said. "I'm going to stay warm." "Silas, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. And I once knew a man who tried to tame a wolverine." "Virgil froze because the fire went out," Silas said, still digging. "Can't freeze if the fire's under you. Can't freeze if you're dead from burning either." By mid-August, the pit was complete. 3 feet deep, 4 feet long, 3 feet wide. The walls were straight and smooth. The bottom was level. Silas had removed over 30 cubic feet of earth. He lined the bottom with clay, packing it smooth and hard. Then he began laying stones. Obadiah visited on the day Silas started the stone work. He stood at the edge of the pit and shook his head. "Merriweather's grave," he said. "That's what you're building." Silas placed another stone and said nothing. The stonework consumed the entire month of August. Silas had selected his stones with obsessive care back in St. Louis, choosing flat field stones that were approximately 2 inches thick and as uniform as possible. Now he understood why masons spent years learning their craft. Making stones fit together with minimal gaps required patience he had not known he possessed. He started with the pit floor. The clay base provided a level surface, but Silas wanted something that could withstand intense heat without cracking. He laid flat stones across the entire bottom, fitting them together like puzzle pieces. Where gaps remained, he mixed clay with sand and water, creating a mortar that he packed into every crevice. The floor took 5 days to complete. The walls took 3 weeks. Silas built them up one course at a time. Each stone had to be positioned so its flat surface faced inward toward where the fire would burn. He shaped edges using a hand chisel he had brought from St. Louis, chipping away irregularities until stones seated firmly against their neighbors. Between each course, he applied his clay-sand-mortar mixture, keeping the layer thin but complete. The pit walls rose slowly. 6 inches the first week, another 8 inches the second week. By the third week, the walls stood 2 feet high. Silas worked methodically, checking level constantly, rejecting stones that did not fit properly, reshaping edges until everything seated correctly. Obadiah Stark visited twice during construction. On his first visit, the walls were 8 inches high. "Still think you're building your own grave," he said. Silas continued, working. On the second visit, the walls were nearly complete. Obadiah walked around the pit, examining the stonework. "I'll give you this," he said. "It's fine masonry, pointless, but fine." Clement Fossey stopped by in late August. He studied the pit for a long time without speaking. Finally, he said, "You are building a bread oven?" "No," Silas said. "Then what?" "A place to sleep warm." Clement frowned. "Inside this?" "Over this." "Ah," Clement considered. "You will burn. The stones will hold the heat. I will sleep above the stones." "How far above?" 18 inches. Clement shook his head slowly. "This is madness born from grief, mon ami. You should abandon this and build a proper fireplace." But Silas did not abandon it. By the first week of September, the pit wall stood complete at 30 inches above the floor surface. The interior measured 4 feet long, 3 feet wide, and 2.5 feet deep from ground level. Every surface was lined with stone, every gap was mortared. The structure could contain intense heat without deteriorating. Silas tested the construction by building a small fire inside. He let it burn for 2 hours, then extinguished it and waited. 6 hours later, the stones were still warm to the touch. 8 hours later, they retained detectable heat. The thermal mass was working exactly as he had calculated. Now he needed to build the platform that would hold him above it. The bed frame required precision that exceeded even the stone work. Silas needed a structure strong enough to support his weight, but designed to allow heat to rise from the pit below. The gap between the coals and his sleeping body had to be exactly right. Too close, and he would burn. Too far, and the heat would dissipate before reaching him. He cut 4 logs for the main supports, each 12 inches in diameter and 6 feet long. These he positioned at the corners of the pit, sinking them 1 foot into the ground for stability. The logs formed a rectangle that extended beyond the pit edges by 18 inches on all sides, creating a stable base that would not shift or settle. Across these corner posts, he laid crossbeams. He selected straight pine logs, 8 inches in diameter, and notched them carefully to sit securely on the uprights. The crossbeams spanned the pit opening at ground level, forming the foundation for the sleeping platform above. The actual platform required different thinking. Silas needed strength but also ventilation. Solid planks would block heat flow. Spaced planks would allow heat through but might not support weight adequately. He settled on a compromise. He split logs into half-round beams, flat side, up, and laid them across the crossbeams with 2-inch gaps between each piece. The half-rounds were 5 inches wide and ran the length of the pit. He secured everything using the iron pins he had brought from St. Louis. Each connection point received a pin drilled through overlapping wood and clinched on the far side. The frame became a single, rigid structure. The height adjustment mechanism was Silas's cleverest addition. He cut notches into the corner posts at 3 different heights, 12 inches, 18 inches, and 24 inches above the pit opening. The crossbeams could be repositioned into any of these notches, raising or lowering the sleeping platform. This would allow him to adjust distance from the heat source based on how hot the coal bed burned. Barnabas Quinn arrived on the day Silas completed the frame. He walked around the structure twice, studying it from every angle. "It's well built," he admitted. But you are still planning to sleep on top of a fire. On top of controlled coals, Silas corrected, 18 inches above them, with stones absorbing and radiating the heat. And when the coals flare up in the night, they will not flare. Coals burn steady, no flame, just heat. And when your platform catches fire, it will not catch. The gap is sufficient. I have calculated this. Barnabas shook his head. You have calculated how to die in your sleep. When this kills you, I am putting that on your marker. Here lies Silas. Merryweather. He calculated wrong. But Silas had not calculated wrong. He tested the platform by building a coal bed in the pit and measuring temperatures at different heights. At 12 inches, the heat was intense, almost painful. At 18 inches, it was strong but manageable. At 24 inches, it was pleasant. He set the cross beams at 18 inches and began preparing for the final component, the sleeping surface itself. October 3rd, 1839. The first hard frost arrived overnight, coating the ground white and turning morning breath visible. Silas decided this was the day to test his system completely. He had finished the cabin walls the previous week, simple log construction surrounding his heated bed pit. Now he would discover if months of obsessive work had produced survival or suicide. He spent the morning selecting fuel, not just any wood, but dense, hardwood that would burn down to long-lasting coals. He chose oak pieces he had been curing since August, split to uniform size. Each piece was roughly 4 inches thick and 2 feet long. He loaded the pit carefully, stacking wood in a crosshatch pattern that allowed airflow. At midday, he lit the fire. The wood caught quickly and burned hot. Flames rose 2 feet above the pit opening. Silas fed the fire steadily for 3 hours, adding wood as pieces burned down, building up a substantial coal bed. The stone walls absorbed heat, glowing faintly in the dimming afternoon light. By late afternoon, the wood had transformed into a deep bed of red-orange coals. No flames remained, just intense glowing embers covering the entire pit floor. Silas used an iron rake to spread the coals evenly, ensuring uniform heat distribution. Then he waited for the intensity to moderate slightly. At dusk, he positioned his sleeping surface. The buffalo hide he had prepared was thick and heavy, tanned to suppleness but retaining its natural strength. He stretched it across the platform frame, securing the edges with leather thongs tied to the support beams. The hide formed a taut surface, suspended 18 inches above the coal bed. He placed his hand near the hide surface. Heat radiated upward, strong and steady. Not the searing intensity of open flame, but deep penetrating warmth. He pressed his palm against the hide. It was hot but not burning. He could hold his hand there for several seconds before discomfort forced him to move it. As full darkness arrived, Silas lay down on the hide. The sensation was immediate and profound. Heat surrounded him from below, rising through the platform, warming his entire body. The hide itself had absorbed warmth and radiated it against his back and legs. He adjusted his position, finding the temperature varied slightly across the surface. The center, directly above the deepest coal concentration, was hottest. The edges were slightly cooler. He lay there for an hour, monitoring his comfort and safety. The heat remained constant. No flames erupted. The platform did not ignite. His clothing did not scorch. He was simply warm, completely, thoroughly warm in a way he had not experienced since Virgil died. He slept. When he woke 8 hours later, dawn light filtered through the cabin's single window. He was still warm. He looked over the edge of the platform into the pit. The coals still glowed, dimmer now but unmistakably alive. The system had worked through the entire night. Silas lay back down and closed his eyes, allowing himself to feel something he had not felt in months: hope. Winter came early in 1840. By late December, snow had already accumulated to depths that veterans of the territory called unusual. Silas prepared methodically. He cut hardwood throughout November, selecting oak and hickory exclusively, rejecting softer woods that burned too quickly. He cured the wood under shelter, stacking it where air could circulate, but rain and snow could not reach it. By January, He had enough dense firewood to last any normal winter twice over. January 7th, 1840. The sky turned a peculiar gray-yellow color that old trappers recognized immediately. The air felt heavy, oppressive. Temperatures dropped sharply as afternoon approached. Obadiah Stark stopped at Silas's cabin that evening. "Big storm coming," he said. "Might last a week." "I am ready," Silas said. "You got enough wood?" "More than enough." Obadiah glanced at the heated bed pit, visible through the open door. "You still sleeping on that thing?" "Every night since October. Has not killed you yet, I will grant that." Obadiah shifted his weight. "Storm like this, you might want to stay with me and Clement. We could share firewood, keep one big fire going." "I will be fine here." Obadiah nodded. Slowly. "Your choice, but if you change your mind, you are welcome." The storm began that night. Snow fell steadily, driven by winds that increased as darkness deepened. By morning, drifts had buried the cabin's window halfway up. By day 2, the window was completely covered. Silas lived in a dark cave illuminated only by the glow from his ember pit. He had loaded the pit carefully before the storm, creating a deep coal bed from his best hardwood. He added small amounts of wood twice daily, just enough to maintain the coal bed without creating flames. The system worked flawlessly. The cabin stayed warm. He slept comfortably. His firewood consumption was minimal compared to feeding a standard fireplace. Day 5 arrived. The storm showed no signs of stopping. Silas estimated he had used perhaps 1/10 of his wood supply. At this rate, he could maintain heat for 2 months. Day 8. Silas heard something unusual, someone shouting outside. He opened his door against heavy drift and found Ephraim Lockwood, a trapper whose cabin was 3 miles south. Ephraim looked exhausted, ice coating his beard. "Obadiah sent me," Ephraim said, voice hoarse. "He is nearly out of dime. Firewood. Burning furniture now. Wanted to know if you could spare any." Silas brought Ephraim inside. The warmth hit the frozen man immediately. Ephraim stared at the glowing pit, at the sleeping platform above it, at Silas standing comfortably in shirt sleeves. "How much wood have you burned?" Ephraim asked. "Perhaps 20 pieces." "In 8 days?" "Yes." Ephraim walked to the pit edge and looked down at the coal bed. "This should not be possible." "It is thermal mass," Silas said. "The stones store heat. The coals burn slowly. The system maintains itself." "Obadiah called you mad." "Obadiah is burning his furniture." Day 9. Silas loaded a travois with firewood and fought through chest-deep drifts to reach Obadiah's cabin. The journey of half a mile took 2 hours. He found Obadiah huddled near a fireplace burning chair legs and table planks. The cabin was barely above. Freezing. Silas left 20 pieces of dense oak and returned home. His own cabin remained warm. His coal bed still glowed from the original load, supplemented by minimal additions. Day 12. Barnabas Quinn appeared at Silas's door, half frozen. He had attempted to reach the trading post for supplies and been forced to turn back. His own cabin had become uninhabitable after a chimney stone cracked, filling the interior with smoke. Ephraim Lockwood had taken him in, but both men were now sharing diminishing resources. Silas provided more firewood and told them about his system. Barnabas listened with the expression of a man confronting something that violated natural law. Day 15. The storm intensified. Wind speeds increased to levels that made even short-distance travel suicidal. Silas remained in his cabin, comfortable and warm. He slept long hours on his heated platform. His food supplies were adequate. His firewood consumption remained minimal. He added perhaps 3 pieces per day to maintain the coal bed. The stones in the pit wall stayed hot constantly, radiating stored heat even when the coals burned low. That afternoon, someone pounded on his door. Silas opened it to find Ephraim Lockwood, alone this time, struggling through the blizzard. "I came to see if you were still alive," Ephraim shouted over the wind. Silas pulled him inside. Ephraim stood in the warm cabin, snow melting off his clothing, staring at the ember pit with an expression approaching religious awe. "How long since you added wood?" Ephraim asked. "This morning." 3 pieces. And before that, yesterday evening, 3 pieces. That is all? That is all. Ephraim walked to the pit and knelt beside it, holding his hands over the heat. The coals glowed steady and deep. "We are burning everything we own," he said quietly. "Furniture, tools, anything that combusts. We might last another week if the storm breaks. If it does not, we will freeze. How many are at your cabin?" "4 now. Barnabas, myself, Clement, and Rutherford Crane. He showed up yesterday, nearly dead. His cabin roof collapsed under snow weight." Silas considered. "Bring them here. There is no room for 6 men. There is room enough to survive." Day 17. 6 trappers occupied Silas's 16 by 12 cabin. They took turns sleeping on and near the heated platform. The system handled the increased demand easily. Silas increased his wood additions to 5 pieces twice daily. The coal bed expanded slightly, but remained controlled. The cabin stayed warm enough that men could sleep without fear of freezing. Day 21. The storm ended. The silence woke everyone. They emerged from the cabin into a transformed landscape. Snow had drifted to heights of 12 feet in places. The world was white and still and brutally cold. But they were alive. All 6 of them. Day 23. Silas's ember pit still produced warmth from the coal bed he had started before. The storm began. The other trappers had returned to assess their cabins. 3 structures were uninhabitable. Obadiah's fireplace had cracked from thermal stress. Barnabas's chimney remained unsafe. Rutherford Crane had no cabin at all. They returned to Silas with questions about how he had built his system. Silas spent 3 days explaining the principles: thermal mass, controlled combustion, heat storage and gradual release, underground insulation, platform height calculations, coal bed management. He shared every detail freely. Some men listened with skepticism still visible on their faces. Others took notes using charcoal on pieces of bark. Spring of 1840 brought reconstruction. Ephraim Lockwood built the first ember pit system in his own cabin, following Silas's design precisely. Obadiah Stark built a second, modifying the dimensions slightly for his larger frame. By summer, 4 trappers had constructed heated sleeping platforms. By autumn, 7. The systems proved themselves immediately. The winter of 1840–41 was severe but not catastrophic. Men who had built ember pits slept warm on minimal fuel. Men who relied on traditional fireplaces struggled through cold nights and depleted wood supplies rapidly. The contrast was undeniable. Word spread beyond the immediate trapping community. Gideon Talmadge at the trading post began stocking flat stones specifically for pit construction. He charged premium prices and sold out regularly. Trappers traveling through the territory stopped to see the heated bed systems, examining the stonework and asking questions about construction techniques. In 1842, an 18-day blizzard struck the northern territories. Ephraim Lockwood survived comfortably in his cabin, burning through only a fraction of his firewood supply. 2 trappers 15 miles north froze to death when their conventional heating failed. The mortality difference was stark and impossible to ignore. By 1845, heated sleeping platforms were common throughout Montana and Wyoming territories. Variations appeared as different builders adapted the core principles. Some built circular pits instead of rectangular. Some used different stone types. Some experimented with platform heights and materials. But the fundamental concept remained constant: thermal mass beneath. The sleeper, controlled ember combustion, multi-day heat retention from single fuel loads. Estimates vary, but historians believe the technique saved dozens of lives over the following 2 decades. Frontier survival was a matter of small margins. Men died from exposure, hypothermia, and fuel exhaustion with brutal regularity. Any innovation that improved those margins had measurable impact. The trappers began calling them Meriwether beds, though Silas never claimed credit or sought recognition. He continued working his trap lines through 1847, then moved to Oregon Territory, where he purchased land and raised cattle. He married in 1849, started a family, and lived quietly, Silas Merriweather died in 1863 at his Oregon ranch, age 58. His death went unrecorded in any newspaper. His gravestone listed only his name and dates. But in the mountains he had left behind, cabins still stood with stone-lined pits built into their floors and sleeping platforms positioned above carefully banked coals. The impossible innovation had become standard practice. Men slept warm through winter storms that would have killed them a generation earlier. And the technique born from one man's grief and obsession outlived everyone who had ever called him mad.